Charleston, South Carolina, a lovely place in the United States, but it wasn't always wonderful for everyone. The first place I will talk about is the Blake Grimki House, which was used in 1836 to 1838. It was used to bring white women and black women together. It was run by Sarah and Angelina, who were known as the Abolished Sisters. They taught slavery was terrible and spoke their views and published a book about their experience. Our next stop is the Fort Sumter National Museum. Charleston is known for its lush plantations. That's why so many Southerners believed it was necessary to have slaves work in the fields. Slave life in Charleston, as it was throughout the U.S., was brutal. Whether they worked in the city or in the fields, they were treated horrendously. If a slave ever talked back or did something their owners didn't like, they'd be beat, whipped, or sometimes even killed. They often worked long hours and weren't permitted to stop until their work quota had been met for the day. Enslaved African Americans performed a variety of jobs, from manual labor to housekeeping to trade skills. Slaves were often traded or rented out to other masters or bosses in the area as well. If an enslaved person worked for someone else, his or her owner would be paid the wages.
Between 1700 and 1775, some 40% of enslaved Africans brought into the 13 colonies came through the port of Charleston. Officially, in 1808, the foreign slave trade was abolished, but American-born slaves continued to be bought and sold until the end of the Civil War. The old Slave Mart on Chalmers Street in Charleston was used for slave auctions starting in 1852. It became a museum in 1938. In fact, it was the first African-American museum.
Next stop is the Old Slave Market, also known as Ryan's Market, who was the man who built this building with the help of his slaves. This was the first visual clue that slavery could be coming to an end, or at least the sale of slaves. It was the year of 1856, and this year, the city made slave sales on the streets illegal, though that was the same day that the old slave market opened up in the city. The city did this because slave auctions flooded the streets with people and caused traffic jams. It also looked bad for new people arriving and seeing people be sold in public. The Port of Charleston is our last stop. It was the largest slave port in the United States, and almost half of all the enslaved Africans who came to the United States first arrived in the Port of Charleston. Nearly half the citizens of Charleston were enslaved before the Civil War. 80% of African Americans could potentially trace an ancestor who first arrived in Charleston. This shows visitors the importance of Charleston's location in the slave triangle and the journey an enslaved person had to do from Africa to America to England. After doing some more research, I found out that a black slave owner that went by the name of William Ellison was the fourth richest man in South Carolina in the 1820s. He lived in Statesburg, one of the wealthiest areas in South Carolina.
Stack of letters while playing in the basement of this home. Those letters, now held at USC's Caroliniana Library, tell the story of a slave named April.
There's been a really good job of whitewashing a very awkward discussion.
It's a hugely awkward discussion.
In 1802, a white plantation owner named William Ellison lent one of his young slaves, April, to work for a gin maker in Winnsboro. April quickly became the go-to man for repairing the expensive cotton gins throughout the Sumter area.
They send him out to the plantations and they take them apart. He would sharpen them on location. And that's why he heard about Statesburg. He came through here as a young man, and he said, well, when he bought his freedom or whatever, he came here.
The center of plantation country, the wealthiest area of South Carolina. He changed his name. April was now known as William Ellison, the name of his former white owner. His gin business prospered. He bought this home, hundreds of acres of land, and eventually 68 slaves to work that land.